Fire.
Just read Meridian and
Fire now.
Be Meridian. If there's still active shooting, we'll take the Bearcat, head that way. 39.
Upper Sioux, it's going to be Locust Grove and U-Stick, and they just put out a shot flyer, just so you know, on the route.
This is the 1032 podcast, where we interview experts in firearms and training with law enforcement, military, and competitive shooting backgrounds. All right, this is the 1032 podcast. This is Raul Garcia, and I have a good friend of mine, Yong Lee. Yong Lee is a retired police officer from Bellevue, Washington, and he's also a 5-time Grand Master in USPSA pistol shooting. And he's here today. We're going to talk a little bit about training, the evolution of firearms training as it relates to law enforcement. How you doing, Yong?
Doing well. Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Appreciate it, bro.
Well, we've known each other for a few years. Briefly, years ago, we met briefly here and there at the Idaho Glock match, and you'd come down from Washington with a couple other guys, and on occasion we would shoot on the same squad, and I was always like, man, that guy's fast. How can I shoot like him? I still can't do it.
Yeah, that was interesting because I've known you for a long time, but only one day or year for about 10 years before 2019 when my wife and I moved over here. So that's interesting. So we've known each other for 15 years, but the first 10 years is just one day a year.
At the match, right?
Yeah.
And what caused you to move to Idaho?
Well, I think it's primarily you.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Well, it wasn't because of my good looks, though.
I wouldn't go that far. But, you convinced my wife and me that this is the place because we were looking for a place to move out of, left coast, Seattle area. And we've been looking for a while. And she and I both shoot competitions, so we decided to come together. And you were kind enough to let us stay in your place. And I think you fed us, like, every meal. And every meal, you were telling us about how great Idaho is. And you took us around. And next thing you know, about 3-4 days later, we go back home to Washington State. And my wife tells me we're moving to Idaho.
She decided for you, huh?
Yeah, and she listed the reasons, and I agreed 100%. So we started looking. I think the match was April, and we started looking for a place here, I think, in May. And we came back and looked for a place. And I think we sold our place in Washington State and moved over here. I think it was late June, almost July. Yeah, and we love it here.
The unfortunate thing, the state's full now. So.
It is full. It's a good thing we got in because now there's a big wait list.
Yeah.
So you can't come unless you get on that wait list. And, you have to have approval.
You got to be a Second Amendment guy, right?
Exactly.
All right, Young. So what have you been doing since you've been retired? You've been retired for a little while now, right?
Yeah, I retired for just over 5 years now. December 31st, 2018 is when I retired. And I've primarily been, continuing to shoot competition, but, I have a almost 4-year-old, as you know. I'm one of those guys that did it backwards, retired, and then had a kid. A lot of people laugh at me over it, but actually it's tough. But I really love it that I have a little 4-year-old, almost 4-year-old girl.
So your life's changed a little bit with that, huh?
Oh,
Quite
yeah.
a bit.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, sleeping, big problem. At least first year. But she's great. She's a little fireball. I guess we shouldn't have named her Annie Oak Lee. She's living up to her name. And, she's really interested in firearms already. But no, we love it here. I've been doing some teaching.
You travel around mostly for your teaching. You don't do
mostly
too much here locally.
Washington, California, New Mexico, Idaho, Florida. I've gone to Connecticut. Those states. Some states I go back several times a year. But
and are those open classes or are they law enforcement?
No, they're law enforcement. that's where my passion is. I want to stay connected to law enforcement community, and plus, all the knowledge that I gained over the 30 plus years in firearms, I like to pass it on, because I think over the years I've seen instructors and officers who are very talented who unfortunately like to hold on to their knowledge and only pass on just enough. And I'm not one of those guys. I pass on everything I know, and every year, every month, every day I learn something new, and I incorporate that into my classes, my training format, and I try to pass it on as best I can.
And when you retired from your agency, you were in the training unit, correct? So I guess that kind of follows with, kind of your philosophy, what you're talking about there.
Yeah, so just a little bit of background. I started law enforcement in College Station, Texas, as a patrolman. That's where Texas A&M University is. And department of about 67 officers at the time. And I really had a passion for firearms already, even though we started with Smith & Wesson revolvers, 357s. Some had 44 Magnums. Those were the primary weapons. After 3 years, my then wife and I moved to Washington State, and I got on with Bellevue, Washington, which has about just short of 200 officers now. And I stayed there from 1991 to 2018 when I retired. And I did various things, mainly patrol, field training officer, SWAT for 11 years, last 3 years as a SWAT team leader. But I also did detective work in gangs, auto crimes, those kind of things. But I was fortunate enough right away to get on the firearms staff in 1991, and didn't know what the heck I was doing. I knew I loved to shoot and I loved to teach, but I got on. It took me a long time to really understand what I'm doing, what I should be doing. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, why that is. And then it probably wasn't until about 96, 97 where I really understood what it takes to be a good shooter, good instructor, or I began to understand around there. It took me a while. And then I was fortunate enough in 2002 to get the department chief firearms instructor, range master, and firearms training program director. And along with that, I was in charge of the TASER program, as well as helping with the use of force program as well. So I did that last 16 years of my career as full-time. So primarily firearms, some TASER, and then started my own business just before I retired in 2018 called Master Reflex Shooting Institute, dealing with red dot pistol optic, instructor for the instructors. So teaching other instructors in firearms how to teach red dot shooting. So that's my little
That's
history.
interesting. Sounds like you kind of seen an evolution in law enforcement, because you started at a time when people probably were carrying revolvers, I'm assuming, right? And then you saw the transition to semi-autos, and then the way the training has changed from, the semi-autos in the early days to, with only iron sights, to red dots today.
Exactly. The only semi-auto shooter in my academy class was one person. Rest of us had usually model 686 Smith & Wesson 357 Magnum. Some had Colt Python. Everybody
I wish I
wanted
still had one of those.
Yeah, it was back in 1988. Those went for like $800. Just think about the $800 back then, because when I started law enforcement as a probationary officer, they were paying us $16,900 a year. I mean, when you're talking about that and $800, you have to buy your own revolver. It's not like now where a lot of the large agencies, they issue your firearms, everything else. We had to buy everything. So, but I settled on the Model 686. I really loved it, but I realized the shortcomings of it really quick, even though at the time people with revolvers were making fun of semi-autos, especially 9mm, because they didn't think the 9mm would do anything to a human body, and now we know with the technology of the 9mm that's not true. It's just as good as probably any other caliber, or insignificant differences, and so I bought into that. Shooting the revolver. I learned to shoot the revolver double action very well. But shortcoming is that when I went to my first combative course with 18 rounds, a few guys with Glock 17, back then he was just coming in the department, and they were finishing 18-round combat course where you have to move around all over the place with one magazine, 17 plus 1. And I was trying to do speed reload twice, and I dumped 6 rounds right into the grass. And so now I have to go to my pocket and use speed strips. You've seen those, right?
Yes.
You remember those?
Yep.
6 rounds on a strip of rubber, and you peel off in 2 rounds, or 1 or 2 rounds at a time. You feed it. And I realized after going through that course, if I get in a combative, I could probably get killed easily trying to do that. So I went and bought a Glock. I didn't even know hardly anything about semi-automatic pistols. Went and bought a Glock. They did give us a 2-day transition course, but now I know that those were real basic and old school, if you will, that doesn't translate to combatives very well, or even competition shooting, effective competition shooting. And as you know, back then, especially for those who shot Glocks, were really into hard front sight focus and pinning the trigger and shooting off the reset, or some people like to call it the click bangers, right? You
Yeah.
wait for the click and you bang the trigger. Yeah, that might work sometimes, but when you're fighting for your life, you're not going to be looking for or feeling for the click, and you're not going to be waiting for the reset. You're going to let go of the trigger. You're going to try to get the rounds off as fast as you can, as effective and fast as you can, and neutralize the threat. Now, and also the front sight hard focus, I knew quickly that something was not right there. And, if you have all the time in the world, if the target is standing there, you had no issues. You can take the time to look at the target, set the sights on the target, center of the target, focus on the front sight with blur target and slightly out of focus rear sight, and you work the trigger. Sure, it works in that format, but as soon as that target moves, or you're shooting multiple targets, or you're moving and you got stress, you're emotionally aroused, heart's pumping, you're not using the same part of the brain, therefore you're not seeing the same, and things start breaking apart. And I realized that right away. It just didn't make sense. Not only that, when you go into the academy, people will ask or tell you, right, your TAC officers, your instructors at the academy will tell you, keep your eyes on the hands. The hands was going to kill you, right? So I listened to that. And then when you go to the range, they said, focus on the front sight. And I go, well, which is it? Am I looking at and focusing on the hands, the chest, belly area, or am I focusing on the sight? Which is it? Or trying to do both back and forth causes this mass confusion. And then they do what I call just point and bang. You just point and slam the trigger. And sometimes you do okay because target's real close. You're in tune with the muzzle of the gun, and you do pretty decently. But as soon as the target becomes more than conversational distances, chances of hitting diminishes. And you've heard of all these, even large departments where the hit ratio is like 20%.
Or even less,
or
right?
less. And 20% of those hits are like outer edges of the body, like arms, leg, foot, or something like that. It's not center mass punching. So I knew something was really wrong. And of course, I try to find out more and a lot of pushback by older generation instructors.
And this is what time period? Back in the
This
90s?
is 90s, still 90s, early 90s to mid 90s, still a lot of pushback. Even at the academy at the time, a lot of pushback. And just teaching hard frontside focus and click banging or pinning the trigger and releasing slow until you feel the reset and then firing is really ridiculous when you're teaching people combatives. And so my journey, my quest from 90s until I retired, even now, was the truth. How do you really shoot train, and how should you really shoot a firearm, especially handgun, that is not like a rifle, where it's not shoulder mounted. You're not gripping the gun the same way. You don't have a cheek weld where the muzzle is pointing where you look very easily. Handguns different, very difficult. But there's I figured out the best way to teach people for success over the years, and I think that's why we're here to talk about, right?
Yeah. I like this. I like talking about the evolution of firearms training, as far as law enforcement especially, because I think, looking back through my 30-year career, I feel like a lot of my instructors were really behind what was going on outside of law enforcement when it comes to firearms training. And the only way I found that out is just going out and, go and ask questions to other law enforcement guys, other SWAT guys. And I was always directed from guys that I thought were high-level shooters in SWAT or law enforcement. They always directed me towards competition.
Yeah, I did some law enforcement competition in the early 90s, but it really fell short to what it should be. And it was more, there was some stress involved, but it was still accuracy-oriented, which is nothing wrong with accuracy-oriented, but it's got to be combined with time factor as well, because you don't have all the time in the world when you're in combatives. So people were bad-mouthing competition shooting, especially something like USPSA, the United States Practical Shooting Association. And I bought it because, other guys would say, hey, never go to the IPSC. They used to call it IPSC shooting, right? IPSC, never shoot IPSC, because you just learn how to point and slap that trigger and teach you bad habits, and it's going to get you killed. I've heard that so many times in the 90s, early 90s to mid 90s. I got scared of it. I said, I better not go there. Until late 90s, while I was still dabbling at law enforcement type of competition, more accuracy oriented, taking cover and stuff like that. Once again, there's nothing wrong with that, but it's got to be combined with time pressure. So I went to my first USPSA type of a match in 1998, and all I needed to do was shoot one match. And it was like a light bulb going off, and I realized I've been duped. I've been screwed over, and I could have been doing this since early 90s, not late 90s. So I lost probably 8 years, maybe more, of being able to compete in USPSA. Once I started competing in USPSA, it changed everything for me. And combining that with understanding human dynamics of a human factor in combatives, under pressure, when somebody's trying to kill you, whether it's shooting at you or trying to slash you with the knife or whatever it is, your brain works differently. And in competition, you tend to harness that part of the brain a little bit better than just shooting, accuracy-oriented sports or training.
When you first saw your first match, what was it that stood out to you? Was there one or two things that just really stood out that made that light bulb go on?
Yeah, what really got it going was number one, I realized right away it was different part of my brain working when you're under a lot of pressure, especially time pressure. Different part of the brain, and when a different part of the brain, or specifically midbrain, is activated, the way you look at the targets, the way you look at the gun, the way the gun feels in your hand is all different. So what happens is you lose that ability. So if you want to call it automatic pilot, sympathetic nerve system activates and fine motor skills go, and you tend to do things that are most realistic and most rehearsed. So what's most realistic to succeed in that endeavor, and then what's most rehearsed. However, I realize if the most rehearsed technique or things you're doing is unrealistic, you won't do it. You just bypass it. And what I come out is really an abomination at times. Sometimes you get lucky and some superior technique comes out on its own. But regardless, you have to bring yourself and use that midbrain, the automatic pilot, and harness it if you want to succeed, whether in competition or in combatives. Now, you can get pretty decent even in competition, just using things like front sight focus, pinning the trigger. You can do pretty well. But if you look at the top shooters, the ones who are winning, the national level shooters, they're not doing that. The kinesthetically, guns or the muzzle lines up to them. They focus on the target, reference the sight or the red dot, and trigger the gun in a most effective manner, which is, in general, if you're close, you just letting go the trigger and pulling back without slamming the trigger against the gun, or flinching by gripping and moving the gun. If it's the distance, you have a little bit more time, so you have a little bit more time to think, then you're letting the trigger go, prepping the trigger to the point of the wall, and then squeezing through, so you're not slamming the trigger. So, and you may use a little bit more sight or the dot if the target is far away. Now, I used to think that, well, if the target is far, then I focus on the front sight, and then I focus on the dot. If target is close, I just reference the dot or the sight and shoot, like target focus. So meaning close targets, anywhere from 0 to, let's say, 7 yards. You're just looking through the sight or the scope or the optic and referencing the dot or the sight and just shooting. And then when you're at distance, I used to think of, well, at distance, use front sight focus and then you prep and squeeze. The problem is your brain cannot make that transition very effectively, very fast. So what ends up happening, either you miss everything at distance or you're very, very slow and methodical and you're going to lose. So what I realized is that you can target focus at all distance. The difference is you're waiting a little bit so you can see the dot or the sight, enough of it indirectly with indirect vision so that you know where it is. Now, again, top guys, they know that when they look and mount a gun, and if they see the dot, everything is lined up because they practice so much.
Isn't it more difficult, though, to target focus at distance? Like, right, you can do that at 5-7 yards, but once you get out 25 or 50-yard target, it makes it a little more difficult.
It is a lot more difficult only because you have to wait a little bit until peripherally or indirect vision you can see the sight or the dot. I think the mistake people make is, well, if I'm going to target focus, whether I'm shooting 7 yard, 25 yard, doesn't make a difference. I do the same thing. It just won't work because at distance, target's smaller, your gun is moving, your perceived movement of the gun is more. So you're not going to be lining up the dot or the front sight very well, very quickly. So you have to pause a little bit until everything lines up, but you're still maintaining your vision, your focal point on the target. And if you do that, the dot or the sight will come back in line. It's just that it takes a little bit more time, but people don't have that patience, and they're just fired around as soon as they see the target at distance. And then they miss, and they say, well, see, target focus doesn't work at distance. It will work if you know what you're doing and if you practice it. So you got to understand the concept, and you got to understand your own mind, your own body. Because when you get your emotional arousal going, right, when you're under stress, you get aroused emotionally, and then things break apart. Your brain is scrambling back and forth. Sometimes there's confusion between the frontal lobe or the thinking brain and the automatic pilot brain, the midbrain, back and forth, back and forth. If you have enough experience, and there's a method of training where you can harness that during the midbrain, you can kind of hold that position in the midbrain and work in that midbrain with practice. Everybody knows what a combat breathing is, right?
Yeah.
That's all you're doing is when you're like pursuit driving. I remember first time on pursuit driving.
Explain that for people who don't know what that is.
In terms of combat breathing.
The combat breathing, yeah.
Yeah, so give you an example. When I was a rookie, I was sitting in a corner of a parking lot. It was like midnight. I was writing my reports, and this Trans Am going up comes around a turn about 40 miles an hour, hits the curb, bounces off. He sees me, just takes off. It's a residential area. I think it was 25 miles an hour. He's going about 80. And thankfully, it was midnight, so they're in the weekday, so there wasn't anybody there. So I started pursuing and talk about emotional arousal, right? Good and bad. You're excited, you're scared, your heart's pumping, your vision's narrowing, you're not thinking straight anymore. It's just kind of like your automatic pilot's taking over. You don't have
that adrenaline dump.
Yeah, adrenaline dump. You don't have control of yourself as much. What happens is when that happens, when that emotional arousal happens, your amygdala releases adrenaline, and then your heart rate goes to the roof, and your gross motor skills goes to crap. All of these things happen. Vision narrow. Some people to the point where it's like a really narrow, looking through like a tube. Yeah, like a paper tube. Sometimes even worse than that. Sometimes people go like a blackout. And so, but if you've gone through emergency vehicle operation courses, EVOC, what do they teach you? How did they teach you?
How?
Yeah.
To go out and do it.
And then
first you ride with an instructor, right? The instructor, you're the passenger side, and you ride with him, and he kind of shows you how to do things. He explains what he's doing, and then you jump in the car.
Yeah, so he forces you into the midbrain, emotional arousal. And he forces you into doing the technique you learned without the emotional arousal. So it's a spillover. What you're trying to do is teach somebody how to do all the basics of driving, emergency vehicle driving, without the stress, put them on the stress, and have it spill over what you learned in frontal lobe, conscious thought brain, spill that information over to the midbrain and embed it. And if you do it over and over again, it'll embed, and then it'll be there probably for a lifetime. Granted, you lose some of it. I'll give you an example. I think it was around 1993 or so. I was driving to from Washington State to Minnesota in the winter, Christmas time, and I think in Minnesota it was like -30 or something that year, super cold, and my wife at the time and I decided to drive straight through, didn't stop. It's a long drive. I think it's like 16 hours or something like that. And we took turns driving. So around, 9 or 10 o'clock, as we're getting close to the destination, it was snowing. Roads were completely covered in snow, hard packed snow, icy. I was in a 2-lane road and had the brights on, and a deer just darted across. I mean, no, I didn't see it at all, right? So what did I do? Did I slam on the brake and spin out, crash into the ditch? No, it's like automatic pilot. I've done it. That spillover happened and it embedded in my brain, in the midbrain. I took evasive action. I didn't apply the brakes. I swerved, gave it some gas. So I powered out of it to the right, where deer was coming from right to left. So I went to the right, and this all happened in half a second. So afterwards, I realized, I go, man, this really works. EVOC really works. So same thing needs to happen in law enforcement firearms training that you do in EVOC, which law enforcement had been doing great for years. But until the last few years, I think we haven't been doing as good of a job teaching officers how to shoot a gun that parallels how to drive a car in EVOC, which is really important. But it's more difficult to do, right? Because you got to put people under stress. Sometimes you got to use sims and shoot at them or hit them with sims. You got to have role players. You got to have courses that takes them out of the comfort zone. Moving and shooting, sprinting, stopping and shooting, shooting multiple targets, shooting at moving targets, reloading on the move, doing strong hand, weak hand really fast, not taking all the time in the world. That kind of stuff. And you can be done. It's difficult, but it can be done. Sometimes simple things make a big difference. Like, for instance, in the SWAT guys, they're pretty in tune with their midbrain in general. If they have at least 5 years on, they've been in some hairy situations. They can control their emotions on the midbrain and bring about good results. But when they go train at firearms, they tend to be repetitive. They tend to kind of goof off a little bit. So you miss that opportunity to train the midbrain. But there's a real simple thing you can do to get them to train the midbrain. What do you think some of those are?
Little competition.
Yeah.
Right.
And why is that?
All your buddies watching because you don't want to screw up, right?
Well, you don't want to screw up in front of your friends. And cops hate losing.
Well, yeah, because especially if you show up to a match your first time, you think, I carry a gun for a living. I'm pretty good.
Exactly.
And then you find out you're not.
And then a 13-year-old girl rocks your world. Mm-hmm. It just pisses you off, right? I mean, I remember my first time came to a shot with Lisa Munson. Lisa Munson, she's about 5 feet tall, maybe 5'1", and maybe 110 pounds at most at the time, in the late 90s, shooting a 40 caliber 2011, one of the first ones in 40. They used to have it in 45, but this shooting a 40 caliber. She's a women's national champion, and everybody goes, oh, well, she's shooting a hand load, right? Yeah, it's a hand load, but it's 180 grain bullet going about 920 feet per second at the time. It's pretty close to the factory loads. So it was not that. It's just that she not just has some decent grip strength, but she knew how to manage the gun, and she had complete control over emotional control. So therefore, she could really compete well, and I watched her shoot, and I was like, there's no way she can control that weapon and beat me, because by that time I was already competing for about a year, and I think I shot about 70% of her or less, and I thought I was really good already after a year. It's a really humbling experience, shooting 70% of somebody that weighs, at the time I was 225, and I can bench press, I think 365, something like that, and you got the 110-pound lady and she was probably about 10 years older than me.
Yeah.
And she's just kicking my butt, So that, but that didn't deter me. I was like, man, I gotta see what they're doing to shoot this well, and that's what competition teaches you. Is the term competition breeds excellence is really true, right?
So the more around the more you're around stressful situations, the better you get at performing under stress.
Exactly.
Right.
Because you're harnessing the technique into that midbrain. And when you're in the emotional arousal, you're able to control it. How many times you've seen a lot of people who can really shoot, I call them the practice champions. When you're doing drills without anything at stake or without pressure, they're just shooting, like almost like a master level USPSA shooter. But what happens when they come to competition? They shoot like, in that USPSA, there's unclassified, there's D class, C class, B class, A class, master, and then grandmaster. So in practice, they can shoot about a master level, the ones that have been doing it for a long time. But then they come to a match or under pressure, they're shooting about a D or C level. I'm sure you've seen this, right? And it's because they don't have the spillover from the frontal lobe to the midbrain. So that's really important. And I've seen this, since I've been teaching since '91. I've been watching people, whether they're cops or competitive shooters, and I got to the point where you can kind of predict where they're going to be when the pressure comes.
But you see that out on the street. I can remember working patrol, especially in my later years. We have an incident, and there's multiple officers on scene, and you got people screaming, almost out of control, trying to give commands, and nobody understands what they're saying because you got 2 or 3 guys screaming different commands, or you have a pursuit that comes to a stop, and you got guys running up to the car trying to break windows out and pull people out instead of doing a felony stop. That happens with guys on the street that don't have a lot of experience, and it just kind of drives you nuts when you've been doing it for a while and you feel like everybody else is out of control because everybody's screaming and giving commands that no one understands.
Yeah, and one thing that just came to mind is whether it's firearms or high-risk stops, or sometimes called felony stops. When you see people, the ones that screaming and losing their minds, have you noticed that some of them just keep doing it over and over and over?
They do.
Yeah. So why is that? Just like shooters, you give them remedial training, right? Over and over. I've had people that I gave remedial training, for 10, 15 years, and they still don't perform under stress, like under pressure of qualification or under like Sims training. You notice that?
Yeah.
Can you kind of...
And what do you think?
Have you figured out why that is? I think I figured it out.
I think it's
many
just
years
because
ago.
there's a lot of people who don't take training that seriously.
Yeah, so if your technique in the frontal lobe is bad, it's going to be bad in the midbrain, even if it spills over. Also, if you don't correct the bad behavior on the midbrain, you're not going to change that. So give you an example. So, and I'm sure, being a longtime firearms instructor, a very good one at that, you've seen this, I think. So you teach a remedial shooter how to do the trigger correctly, the grip correctly, everything correctly, because they're just like chopped liver, right? And then, okay, you got everything. You can hit center mass all day, all different distances with, no problem. Strong hand, weak hand. Then you put them on the qualification with time pressure. What happens?
It falls apart.
It's just like before.
Yeah.
They're shooting 50% again. What in general law enforcement needs to be at least 70% or whatever, 60, 70% to pass. They're back to the old habits. Why? Because what's embedded in the midbrain is all the negative techniques.
So can you explain what that means when you're talking about the midbrain and the front
Yeah.
lobe?
So like I said before, you got the frontal lobe and you learn this technique. If you learned it properly, good technique, realistic, good technique, what happens is when you're under stress, after repeated training under stress with emotional arousal, that spillover from the good technique from the frontal lobe will come across to the midbrain and it'll embed. So after a while, you perform really well in the midbrain. And like for instance, in firearms, you get good hits under stress. If your technique is terrible in the frontal lobe, right? Like things like you're anticipating, you're yanking the trigger, you're not using the sights properly, you're not focusing on anything, your posture is terrible, all of these things. Grip is loose, and then you train them and put them in pressure, under pressure, where they get emotionally aroused. You do it over and over again. The spillover is the bad technique, right? So every time you put them under stress, only the bad technique comes out because no good technique has spilled over yet. Now here's the big problem, is once you get those techniques embedded in the frontal lobe and the midbrain, you think it'll come out easily?
It's like creating a bad habit, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, you made a pathway of crappy technique, and it became permanent. So now you got to go in there. One, you got to teach with the frontal lobe, without pressure, all the good technique. You got to do it over and over again. Without pressure, now they can do it really well. Then, that takes effort and time, right? Then, you do the same thing with pressure, emotional arousal, and make them do it, the good technique. But they start to falter and go back to the old technique because midbrain has the old technique in there. So what do?
Got to keep practicing the good ones, I guess.
Yeah, for about 20 years. So back in early 2000s, maybe it was like 2006, maybe it was mid-2000s, I cross-trained and I took a class from Seattle PD. A lot of people talk crap about Seattle PD, but reality is, they have outstanding training unit. They give outstanding training. Whether everybody does what they're told, that's a different story. But their training unit is outstanding. I know several of those guys. They really understand how to train people and set them up for success. And one of the things I learned during the week-long training they had is the pause technique. So what they did, and we started incorporating it in mid-2000s and with great success. When you do, whether you're training firearms under stress or role-playing, sims, when you put somebody under emotional arousal and they start to falter and use bad technique, you don't let them continue. If you let them continue that pathway of failure, you just got one more repetition embedding into the brain. And what law enforcement traditionally, I think, did was you let them fail and then you give them the riot act. You're a piece of crap. You need to straighten up. That was ridiculous. That's stupid. What were you thinking? Well, they weren't thinking. It was an automatic pilot. So they go, oh, yes, sir, I'm going to try my best. I will never do that again. 6 months later, Sims training, they're doing the same thing again under stress. And you go, you're a freaking idiot. Get him out of the team. That kind of stuff. What's happening is it's embedded into the brain. It's not going to come out until you replace it with the good technique. So the way you do it, you pause them when they're going into the bad technique. Pause them just for about 30 seconds or so. No more than like a minute. Stop them. Tell them what they're doing, and ask them how they need to fix it. So they're like, yes, sir, I need to focus on the target more, or I need to stop holding the trigger back. Okay? Then, without much discussion, very short conversation,
Kind of
30 seconds less.
Let them
You
come
let
up
them
with
talk
the answer.
talk through the solution, and resume. Say in play or something to that effect. Go in play, and let them finish. And you do that over and over again. in the traditional way, you have them fail, you evaluate, you get the evaluation form, you start checking pour. You need to straighten up. That was the kind of the traditional technique. And some people rise above it anyway. Like for me, that somewhat worked because it just really pissed me off. So I just drill until my fingers are bleeding. I'm different. But for most people, I realize they don't have that kind of drive. So you have to get them.
Yeah, I think for a lot of people, you can just shut them down, right? People will just shut
Yeah,
down.
and you've seen this.
Yeah.
And you go, hey, what the hell are you doing? Yes, sir, I'm sorry, I messed up. So you're going to do that again? No, sir, I'm not going to do that again. Head down, defeatist attitude. You knew that, right away, you're not going to get through them. I mean, yeah, you can kick them out of the department or something like that, but I think a lot of those people can be saved. There are few that can't, and they're always on that. Because why? Because poor technique and arrogance, two combination, that makes for the most horrible operator, shooter, whatever. Arrogance. If you can't swallow humble pie, when you're a crappy shooter in the department and you're arrogant and you do things like, well, that's because my gun is too big for my hand, or yeah, it's because we're shooting a 40 instead of a 9. We just get a 9, everything be better. No, it just means recoil is softer, everything is the same. There's no difference.
But you have to have good instructors that understand
Yes.
that type of learning, right?
Yeah, I think it's two failures, right? Is both, if they fail, not always, because sometimes no matter how good the instructor is, they still fail because they refuse to acknowledge their issue. It's kind of like,
Well, some people don't have the interest in shooting.
Exactly.
You would think that they do, being, they carry a gun for a living, but not everybody has that interest like you and I do.
exactly.
I had a friend of mine that I teach with at the academy. He's been around for a long time, gun sight instructor, SWAT guy. His name's Alan Hall. And he used to tell a lot of the other instructors, one of his quotes was, if the student didn't learn, the instructor didn't teach.
Yeah.
And I know that's not 100%, but I think there's some truth to that, because some instructors, just like the students, can be lazy and they just basically repeat what is in the post manual, right? But they don't really understand real teaching and how people learn.
I agree 100%. It goes both ways, right? Sometimes, yeah, definitely it's just all shooter issue. But those are small percentage. How small? I think it's less than 5%, maybe even 2%. Small. Granted, you got to do more work. And some instructors will say, well, I shouldn't have to do the work. I'm not here to baby them. I get that. But if you really want to have good operators under you and you want to be proud that you taught them, yeah, you also have to swallow some pride, even though you want to wring their neck. You got to just kind of control yourself, and you got to stand neutral and not judgmental when they fail, right? If you're judgmental, what happens? Again, they start shutting down.
And as a firearm instructor, how important, like you say, talk about being humble, but how important is it for the instructor himself to be, there's all different types of topics in law enforcement, but what we're talking about here is firearms specifically. How important is it for that firearms instructor to be at a high level himself and be able to perform shooting-wise?
I 100% agree. I vowed early on in my career that when I became a firearms instructor, I'm not going to be one of those guys just yelling out commands. I'm going to demonstrate, right? Just like what you're supposed to do in field training, right? You got to show them how to do it, right? Tell them how to do it, and have them do it. I mean, it's so simple. And yet, many instructors do not follow that format. You got to show them how to do it. If it's just like when you're teaching somebody a simple thing like shooting a basketball, or hitting a tennis ball effectively, can you teach them without showing them? I mean, it's kind of ridiculous, but there are instructors that stay behind the line, tell you what to do, give you 1,000-word dissertation on how to do something. And you know, after the first 50 words, their eyes are rolling behind their head. They're not getting anything. It's wasted breath. You know, picture tells 1,000 words, those kind of things. Show them. And then show them in different format, different angle, different speed. Show them, you know, full speed right off the bat.
Yep, I agree.
Yes,
I think for me, you know, like they always say, hey, in order to be good at something, or if you want to master something, you should become an instructor or teach it, right? But I remember becoming an instructor years ago, but my skill level was probably C-class shooter when it comes to USPSA, and that's
which is actually not that bad, actually.
yeah. I mean, but if we're looking at USPSA, right, you got grandmasters at the top, master A, B, C, D, and so for law enforcement, I would say a lot of law enforcement instructors are like at C-class.
They're probably C-class. Really good ones are about B, probably.
I'm like at 84%, which just puts me just high A class right now.
Yeah.
And I feel like I'm a better instructor now because I'm at a higher level of shooting, going from C to A. I feel like I'm better because I understand what it feels like to miss. I understand what it looks like to miss. Right, I can see it, I can feel it, so I feel like I can, translate that over to instructing. And I think some of the instructors I've seen in firearms, like I say, they just will pretty much word for word tell you what's in the post manual, but they can't tell you exactly. They have a hard time diagnosing students because they don't understand how to miss or how to hit a target correctly, right? They don't know what it feels like.
They don't own it, right? Mm-hmm. They don't own their technique. So you're right. I think, a couple different ways you can go about it. You can get in all kind of combats. Combats like every month or something, but that's not realistic. You're, especially with the handgun up close, which is what most of the time, like law enforcement or self-protection, self-defense type of shooting, pretty close, right? And to go, well, yeah, I've been in like 3 to 5 shootings, therefore you got to listen to everything I said. I mean, there's a lot of knowledge there, but not necessarily translating to teaching somebody. I mean, you still have to understand how you did it and what it takes to shoot at that level consistently. Not just that one time you got lucky or it just everything happened to be right for you, right? You got to be able to do it, repeat it. So as an instructor, getting yourself level, I think at least like a B level in USPSA. I think that's probably sufficient. If you're shooting below that, like D class, you're really doing your students a disservice, right? And also, if you don't do a demo, how do they believe you? When I was first coming up, I was told by several different instructors in classes for firearms instructor classes, never shoot in front of students, because if you do really well, it turns out like a show off. If you mess up, you lose credibility. And at first I kind of thought, that does kind of make sense. But I realized at some point, I said, you got to do it. And and the students will understand. If you know what you're doing, when you do make mistake, you're a human being, you're going to make mistakes. Own the mistake and go, yeah, this could happen. And then move on. It's real, gets to your nerves. I think probably one of the most stressful I've been is the very first time I'm demoing with a live firearm in front of SWAT guys, right? They're like looking at you like,
as if you miss,
you're an idiot, because nobody's going to listen to you. Years ago in King County, this was early 2000. I was asked to teach I'll give just a pistol course, one 8-hour day pistol course to the King County SWAT guys. I think they had something like 22 or 24 in the entry team, and then they had another 12 in the perimeter sniper team. and they had just gone to full-time format. And these guys all can shoot, all shooting Glock 40s. I think he was 22. And a friend of mine who asked me to do the class, he said, Young, they're not going to do anything you say. You're not going to have any credibility until you shoot in front of them. And if you mess up, you're done. They're not going to listen to you at all. These guys are like all...
A little bit of pressure.
Yeah, former Rangers. There was a Navy SEAL guy there, captain. And, but, this is early 2000s. And more so than now, once I understood how to really shoot a gun effectively, starting about 97, confidence grows. And there was like not even a thought of messing up. Or if I messed up, it's going to be something minor where I can recover from it. So it didn't bother me a bit. So, these guys, I just said, okay, I know how you guys are. Okay, you want to see me shoot, see I'm a, crappy shooter, pretending to be a good shooter, or am I a good shooter? So come on over. Let's get it over with. So I did a bunch of drills, and I look back, and they kind of, nod their heads. Okay.
Give you some approval, huh?
And then they started listening. And we had a great class that all day long. I think it's really important you can at least hold your own. Just imagine a jiu-jitsu instructor can't grapple. That's a ridiculous concept,
yeah.
But it happens in firearms, right?
It does.
Because you can go get a firearm certificate from NRA or state or whatever and squeak by, right? Pass the qualification, which is generally not that difficult, right? And then squeak by and you go, oh, I'm an instructor, Now I can teach you how to do it.
Yeah, there's a lot of people like that, unfortunately.
But I think, you can just grab the bull by the horn and then just get yourself to that level, and then it's infectious. You get to your department or your organization, and you just show them the way, and you catch on like wildfire, and everybody wants to do what you do. Just by your presence, they know you can shoot, they know you can teach, they want a piece of that. And a few will leave, and I had that experience. Few will leave because they go, well, I don't want to do that. Well, if you don't want to do what we're doing to better the students, then you probably don't belong in the unit. If you just want to hold that card, says I'm an instructor, and I just run the line, that's only a small part of being an instructor. I think the biggest part is getting officers proficient, at least enough to prevail during gunfights, right? They don't have to be the best shooter in the world.
So what kind of attributes do you think a law enforcement firearms instructor should have?
You have to I think you have to have decent motor skills. You can't be a motor moron.
And how do we measure that?
There's no definitive measurement in.
Because I've said that to people, and some of the responses I've gotten is like, "Well, how good is good enough?" And I'm like, "Well, better than yesterday."
It's
right?
very subjective.
Yeah.
So in my department, during the selection process, I have them do simple things. The things that they've done. They've been in cops for several years. Just tell us how to do. Show us and tell us how you do a speed reload or tactical reload. Show us how to take down, field strip a gun step by step and put it back together. And you know who the motor morons are. If they've been a cop for 3 to 5 years and they can't take the gun apart, put it back together effectively without fumbling it all over the place, they're motor morons.
Because you got some guys who can shoot, but they have a hard time teaching.
Exactly.
And vice versa, right? Some guys can teach, or they can stand up in front of people and talk. They're not afraid to talk publicly or in front of people, but their shooting is not the greatest. Yeah,
during the selection process, have them do simple things that everybody knows how to do relating to firearms. Like I said, just show us how and show us and tell us how you do a speed reload and what's the important factors of it. Just simple things. Tell us how you're going to take this gun apart and then put it back together. Simple things. And I'm talking about you don't have to be the best at motor skills. You just have to be proficient enough to carry out everyday duties. So that's one. Two is willingness to learn. If I had one student really disappoints me, a star. Just everything I teach him, he can do. To the level with drills, he's keeping up with me. But after he got a certain level, he says, "I'm good enough, Young." And I'm like, "What do you mean? You've been doing it for a couple of years now. You got a lot to learn." I don't need to do those. I just want to, just do what I do right now.
He didn't want to progress from
No.
where the level he was at.
Exactly. He's good enough. And he even admitted to himself, to me, he's in the classic underachiever. I got something, I move on to something else, right? I know how to shoot a gun. I know how to shoot 95% on the qualification. I'm good. I don't need to learn anymore. And people with great skills, with that attitude, I think do not make good instructors. So willingness to learn and being humble.
Can you tell me how should someone in law enforcement, whether firearms instructor or not, how should they be training? Say they're going to go out to the range tomorrow afternoon. How should we be training?
I think first, work on stuff that you're terrible at, right? Everybody wants to go do drills they're good at.
Yeah.
And then they go, let's work on the weekend before we go. And then they just do a half-ass job at it and go home. Do your weakest part first when you're the freshest. You go over there, work on your weaknesses. Strong hand, weak hand, whether it's your speed reload, fast shooting, accuracy shooting. I have friends that said, well, when you get in a gunfight, it's all fast, hose and pray. So I'll work on speed shooting. At 5 yards, he's got a shotgun pattern, but he does it real fast. He goes, "I'm good enough." Mm-hmm. Okay, well, he might have a point. However, not all gunfights are 5 yards. Gunfights are sometimes 25 and beyond. Mm-hmm. You're going to be lost.
Yeah.
Granted, it's a small percentage, but nowadays, with more people trying to snipe you with the rifle and stuff, it can be distance. So when that happens, what are you going to do? You're going to spray and pray? That's about it. So if you're, I have friends who never wanted to work on accuracy because they say, well, I'm real fast and decently accurate up close, up to about intermediate distance, 15. I don't care less about 25 and beyond. I just don't care. It's not going to happen. So I think selling yourself short. For those people, I recommend if your accuracy is a problem, work on that first and the most. If speed is an issue, work on that most, right? Because I think if you're going to choose one or the other, I think speed is more important, right? Of course, accuracy
That's not
matters.
true. That's not true. Isn't that Wyatt Earp? What does Wyatt Earp say? Accuracy is, or speed is fine, but accuracy is final. I'm not sure if that's who it comes from, but I hear people say that all the time.
I get that. Hollywood stuff, I get that. But if you can, if somebody tells me I can shoot real fast and get reasonable hits, I'm good to go. I agree with that to a certain extent. You don't want to teach people to be accurate and that's it. They're going to get lost under dynamic, close-up, fast shooting. They're just going to be lost. The mind has never been there. Midbrain doesn't have that in the system, so it's going to come out. It's like basic programming. Whatever basic program you came with, that's what's going to come out, and it's probably going to be junk.
Yeah, one of the things, you watch body cam footage, and officers typically, I would say not always, but probably 90% of the time, you see officers just drawing their gun at close range, and they're just hammering that gun. You know, they're doing a bill drill or mag dump. But then when I go back and I think about law enforcement training, a lot of the times nobody is practicing at that same speed. It's, you know, especially if you're shooting a qualification, you know, there's a qualification speed and then there's what happens on the street. And they're two different things. When people are qualifying, they're taking their time, shooting, and then they get on the street and they're missing. And I think they're missing because they've never trained that way. They've never shot that way, but they're shooting emotionally out on the street, right? And so they're just shooting, pulling the trigger as fast as they can.
Absolutely.
They're doing something that they've really never done before.
Absolutely. A classic thing some people will say is, I can hit a 50-yard target center mass. I ain't going to miss a 5-foot target. How many times have you seen somebody in competition miss a 5-foot target?
Yeah, it's not uncommon.
It's somewhat common amongst the newer people, right? The target is completely clean at 5 yards because their emotional rate is so high that they're not seeing the sight, they're not seeing the target, they're not seeing the sight. They're just looking at a blurred object and just thrusting the gun there. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But besides working on your weaknesses, you should train with something at stake. You know, time pressure, winning against your friends, you know, loser or winner takes it all, you know, whatever it is. Everybody buys the winner a drink or a coffee or whatever it is. Something at stake. You see people rise to the occasion, just simple thing like that. They pay more attention and some people get themselves more jacked up. So naturally you get them into the emotional state, aroused state. Also, when you're training, shoot, move, stop, shoot on the move, shoot strong hand, weak hand, awkward positions, and of course you got to incorporate malfunction clearing, one-handed and stuff, but don't spend all your time on malfunction clearing one-handed, you know, and that kind of stuff, wounded. Because that is something that happens, it's not the majority of the gunfight. So train, you know, use your time wisely.
Know how to do it, but don't.
Yeah, train.
Don't overdo it.
Use your time to train on something that you would do the most. In general, that's shooting real fast on the move, or shoot, move, stop, shoot, that kind of stuff. You know, because it elevates your heart. It's not exactly same, but it'll get you to the point, especially when you put competition aspect of it during training, because nobody wants to be the last. You know, not everybody might think that they're going to be first, but they don't want to be last. So they're going to put themselves into that midbrain. So the training will be more effective, and it'll spill over from frontal lobe to the midbrain, and you know, if the midbrain technique is terrible, that also means that frontal lobe technique needs some work, right?
So when you go out and train by yourself or you and a buddy, do you think it's important? Do you think hit factor scoring is helpful?
Absolutely. As a matter of fact,
And can you explain what hit factor is?
well, hit factor is the way USPSA scores the stages. Ultimately, you get all the points you earned on the target, you divide that by time, and you get a hit factor. So for instance, if you got 100 points on the stage, you do it in 10 seconds, you get 10 hit factor. And then people who do it slower, like 11 seconds, 12 seconds, you just start getting less hit factor. So you might get a 9 hit factor, 8 hit factor, 8.5. So if you're 7 hit factor out of a 10, you only did 70%.
Yeah. So it's not, that comes out to what, points per second is what that
basically.
hit factor is,
Basically.
correct?
So like if you do a 10 hit factor, shot a 10 hit factor stage, you've shot 10 points in general, about 10 points per second. Also, even if you only gained 90 points out of 100, if you win that stage, because you did that in 9 seconds, right? You still shot a 10 hit factor. So you gain, if you're winner of that stage, you gain all 100 points. So regardless of the points. Now, having said that, the stages and the targets are set up. It's virtually impossible to do that with crappy hits. You still got to get really good hits. You still got to shoot 90% of all available
So
points.
it's basically, when you're talking about speed and accuracy, using that hit factor way of scoring, it's basically showing you how fast and how accurate you are.
Yeah, it's a combination. It's a
combination
great
of both, right?
combination of both. So I'm glad you mentioned that, because I'm going to ask you to go out with me and test this qualification from our old department.
Yeah.
Anthony Felder, my replacement, great shooter, great instructor, used to be an NFL football player. He is going to try to pass a hit factor classifier, or qualification. And I
Nice,
read over
nice.
it, and I thought it was really interesting. And he's going to have a bunch of people shoot it to tweak it. And so I told him that when things thaw out a little bit more, you and I go and test it, because
That sounds good.
there's movement involved.
Okay.
So I think hit factor qualification would be ideal. But if you're going to still have the stale square range, standing in one spot, shooting targets over and over with generous times, you got to really try to push the envelope a little bit and compress the time. Make them perform on more with time compression, which raises the emotions and gets you into their midbrain more. So for poor shooters, it'll get them there every time. Because they're panicking, right?
Yeah.
But for good shooters, they're always shoot like 95%. But if you put more pressure on them, even they will falter. So then they learn how to manage their emotions, and then they go back to that 95%. So really, it should be an evolution. Qualification should be an evolution. As a handgun technology and techniques improve, your qualification should get tougher. That's
Yeah,
just my opinion.
And I like that, because you can look, especially if you're shooting a match or where you're keeping score with your buddies or whatever, you can look at the score, at the overall points, and then you can look at the overall time to see who was the fastest. You can see who's the most accurate, and then you can see where you're lacking. Am I lacking in the
Exactly.
speed, or am I lacking in the accuracy
You
part?
can adjust accordingly. Yeah, so it's a fair thing, because, for instance, when I shoot qualification and my buddies, the top 20 guys in the department, we only need half the time to get 98, 99% on the qual. Only half the time. And as a matter of fact, Anthony did a test recently, an old qualification. He set up 3 targets, and he had a bunch of magazines on him. He shot 3 qualifications. In the time that he required to shoot 1, he shot 3 qualifications on 3 targets and shot 85% or better on all 3. So what does that tell you? That qualification is way too easy for modern day. It was fine 20-some years ago. So that's why he's changing it to reflect modern day. And I think looking at the course, he thought about it really well. I think he might need a slight tweaking here and there, but it looks really good. It involves things like moving and shooting and strong hand, weak hand. If somebody takes 10 seconds to shoot 3 rounds with their strong hand only, they're going to get killed if the other person does it in 3, right? And which
Yeah.
is realistic.
Sure.
Nobody's going to give you 10 seconds to shoot at them at 10 yards, 10 seconds to just shoot 3 rounds during combat. This is not going to happen. They're going to be gone, or they're going to shoot you to death, right? So something to look forward to. And I think often we get comfortable as instructors. So we go, well, that takes work. I don't want to do that. But you're selling your officers short. I mean, I always took pride when my officers prevail during gunfights. you know, and they almost every one of them come back and thank me for the training that I gave them.
So a lot of your training is competitive based, performance type training, right? When I say performance training is we're keeping track of our time and our accuracy both, right? And you've been able to pass this on to other people. People have come back to you and said, "Hey, what you're teaching is working for me because I was involved in a gunfight."
Exactly. And what they said was, I saw what you said I was going to see, and I realized had I tried to do things like focus on the front sight or pin the trigger, I would have been smoked. You know, starting about 2004, I think, I made it mandatory for the whole department to go through my target focus training format. So since then, everybody coming out of the academy, before they hit the street, they get target focus training with various different targets. And what I hear from a lot of the more athletic type of people is, man, I want to shoot like this all the time. You know.
Yeah.
So, but people who are hell-bent on that hard front-side focus have a real hard time. They can't make the time limit.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, they either refuse to shoot, pull the trigger within the time limit, or they miss. So you have to really push them. You have to do a lot of work to get them to that point. But once they're realize the superiority of training that way, shooting on the move, target focusing, that kind of stuff, they see the light. Even if they're not shooters, they realize that is the way. And some people just get it without much explanation, which is actually fascinating. People who play certain sports. And also lost my train of thought here for a second. But, you know, if you watch people on their eyes, you can tell if they're target focusing or front sight focusing. I can tell by the body posture. Usually, front sight focusers, you know, they're like real stiff, real methodical. You know, they're not flowing. It's like a robotic. And then target focusers are more relaxed, you know, shooting with more chin up. They're not really constricted, a little bit looser feeling. And over the years, you know, I watch for those things. So I can tell when somebody's target focusing or not. But the virtue of the fact that now, you know, contrary to what some have said 5 years ago, 6 years ago, when I got on a podcast, or Eric Levy, and a lot of the professionals said it'll never happen, that law enforcement will not adopt red dot. I think that's now it's a given. It's just a matter of time until almost everybody adopts it, right? And by the virtue of the fact that they're shooting a red dot, some will automatically start shooting target focus. Unknowingly, just happened that way because your mind wants to do the most efficient way. So if you don't intentionally want to focus on the dot, some people do. If you just let things happen, those people actually learn target focus. So when I teach classes, there's some instructors without ever even given the training, they can do it.
Okay.
So the red dot it's a game changer for everybody, because not only does it help people who are older, who have issues with their eyes, like stigmatism and all those issues, it really helps a wide variety of people, you know. But people always try to make something of it, you know. But like things like, well, I'm cross-eye dominant, so I can't do red dot. Well, not true.
Yeah, I'm actually cross-eye dominant.
Yeah.
I run red dot.
Yeah, not a problem.
But since I started running red dot, I went back to shooting right eye, right
Exactly.
hand, right eye, and no problem.
Because it allows you to make that conversion a lot easier than iron sights. Because with
Yeah.
iron sights, they're puny, they're not very bright, and they have front one, you gotta line up to the rear. So you got two things on the gun and another thing on the target. You got three things to worry about, instead of two.
Yeah.
So that's why the red dot is so effective in getting you to train properly, target focus, and succeed. And if you watch a lot of the gunfights happening with red dot and the videos lately, on social media, YouTube or whatever, you see that they generally do really well with the red dot. They're taking the suspects down. I think more so than iron sights.
Yeah, I have a friend of mine here locally, Corey Feldman. He was on our. In fact, I did an interview with him, and he talked in one of his shootings back when they still had iron sights. He says that it was about a 15-yard shot down the hallway. The guy with the revolver in his hand, he brought his gun up. He said his focus went from the suspect to his front sight, and he said when he did that, the front sight covered up the whole suspect,
Yeah.
and he couldn't see the suspect very well. So
Yeah,
he
I
said
know.
with red dots you can see it better, and that's what he likes.
Yeah, I
about
know.
the red
I know
dots.
who he is,
Yeah.
and it's interesting. Is some people say, well, can you focus on the front sight when you're on the life or death situation? Yes or no? Some people say
see.
absolutely not. Some people say absolutely yes.
Yeah, well, I would say he did.
Some can,
Yeah,
but is that a big number?
probably not.
No. And why do you think they can? Whereas I probably can't.
Yeah, well, because you've been doing target focus for so
No, but I
long
mean,
for
okay,
you.
let's take me out of the equation. Some people, somebody else, they can't. Under stress, they go right to target focus. But Corey can. It has to do with emotional arousal.
Mm-hmm.
Corey's been into a lot of shit, right?
Yeah,
Yeah. So his emotional arousal is nothing like a rookie seeing a guy with the revolver. Rookie with the revolver, scale of 1 to 10, he's like teetering on 10, which is you're going into your brainstem.
out of control.
Yeah. To the point where your lizard brain takes over and you don't know what to do except just thrust the gun and start firing. You're not seeing anything.
Mm-hmm.
So he's like teetering on that. Corey is like not
He's
even
more calm.
He's probably like 3 to 5.
Yeah.
So your brain, he's not anywhere near there. So you're like in a controlled pattern. Even in your emotional state, he's not everybody's same. He's in that state where he can actually see that if he wanted to.
I'm not sure we should be saying so many good things about Corey, though. He might get a little big head. So
Yeah, I remember when he said that. But but he was. That's pretty astute of him to realize that when you do that, you cover the whole target, and you can't see the target. What the hell's going on there?
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
So it can be problematic. For him, he's been there. His arousal is a lot smaller than other people. Doesn't bother him that much. It's kind of like shooting a match or shooting a qualification or something.
Yeah, you go shoot your first match, and almost everybody that I know, including myself, you go to your first couple matches, and you go up there and they say, make ready. Put that magazine in your rack and that slide
Yeah.
holster, and you can just feel your heart
Yeah.
about jump out of your chest, right? And that happened. I don't really get that anymore. I feel pretty calm, but I can remember when, like, my first year or two,
Yeah.
just your heart just starts racing as soon as you get up there.
Yeah. Now you're too calm.
Yeah, I think
You're
I'm,
too calm, and sometimes you like you shoot like initially. I can see you shooting like real, like
relaxed.
relaxed, and when you should be like really aggressive because targets are close because you've been there.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think you need to have a
Happy medium.
more emotionally aroused sport, bro. Or something you get shot at or something. Then you probably shoot faster.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just funny. The more you, like you said, the more you do things, the more you're in a stressful situation,
Yeah.
the better you're able to control those emotions, the more you've been involved
Yeah,
in
so
things, right?
that's the quandary, right? How do you get a rookie or people who ride the desk to experience that? Sims only go so far. Because Sims are great first few times, and then people realize, I'm not going to die.
Yeah. And it's got to be really controlled, too,
Yeah.
right? Because the guys can
Yeah.
screw off shooting
Yeah.
when they're not supposed to
Sims got to be
shooting.
done. Instructor has to really make it worthwhile to get the training effect after the first couple. Because the first couple, you see people like losing their minds. And then they realize,
Yeah, it can become a game for certain
it
people.
becomes a game sometimes. So you gotta use it sparingly, but certainly putting them under stress because the course of fire is difficult and is time compressed. And you don't want to be the last person, slowest person, or the least accurate person on that stage, because you're gonna see the score afterwards, and you're gonna see that you were 50% of Raul Garcia.
Yeah.
You don't want that. So you're going to try to elevate yourself and get yourself higher emotional, which helps you perform faster and better than trying to calm yourself and to the point where you're not emotionally aroused anymore, and you're just going to use frontal lobe to slowly shoot the course. And you see people like that in USPSA. They go, oh, I'm just going to shoot all A's or the center mass. And Young Lee did it in 5 seconds. I'm going to do it in 25. And then you go, well, you shot 10% of them. You go, what?
Yeah, because your speed.
Well, yeah. Because you think you're the only one that could get all A's if you do it in 25 seconds, right? There are a lot of people who can do that.
Yeah.
So if you have that in mind, I think even people who have not been there, when they go there, having experienced some of it and good techniques in the midbrain, they perform a lot better. And they'll come back and thank you that you trained them that way instead of the hard frontside focus only and pinning the trigger and stuff like that, which, by the way, will never leave. Click banging, pinning the trigger will never leave shooting industry, because if you look at YouTube video and someone like JJ Rakaza explaining prep and squeeze and getting up the trigger versus somebody teaching pinning, releasing, and resetting, you see like pinning and resetting gets millions of likes and views. JJ Rakaza get like 50,000, which is pretty good, but not millions,
Yeah.
right? So I think either always rear its ugly head. In the academy, I remember in the academy, in the 20-some years that I've been teaching, back and forth. And a good group of guys come into the academy. 5 years later, they rotate out. They're back to pinning. And then 5 years later, good group of guys come in. They're prepping and squeezing. And then pinners come back.
Well, I think like everything else, you always got your top 20% of guys that always want to evolve. They want to get better. They're always looking for the next best thing. They're training all the time. And the rest are just, you've heard that term, people regurgitate. They're basically just reading word for word from the post manual, right?
Some of them actually read off the sheet, right? They're actually reading it
They
off the
have to
sheet.
because they don't
own
haven't
it.
done it.
They don't
haven't
own
done
it.
Yeah.
It's not in their mind or their heart, so they just have to read it, regurgitate it, and they don't care. I've had guys tell me, well, I don't want to teach that. And I go, well, why aren't you going to teach that? Oh, because they're not going to get it anyway. It's too hard. So even though I prep and squeeze, I teach pinning and the trigger. I go, nah, you're out. You're not in this unit anymore.
Yeah, for many years, law enforcement has taught you got to teach the lowest common denominator in the class, right? And we should be teaching to the higher levels and making them come up, right?
Exactly. And they will rise to the challenge. People don't believe that. But anybody will rise to the challenge if you lead the way and people start following you. Everybody wants a piece of that. And so, but you have to do some work to get there. First is a lead instructor has to be really squared away shooter. Really squared away instructor. You don't have to be a grandmaster. A master, somewhere around there. B, probably okay as long as you can compensate with extraordinary instructing abilities. But you still got to understand what you're doing. You can't be a D class, shooting the outer edge of the targets all the time, under stress, and call yourself a really good instructor. I mean, you got to hold your own.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a fascinating thing, and it's ever evolving. I think technology is having a lot of effect on how to teach somebody. Some of the technology, I don't know. I think it's more of a hindrance. Sometimes you try to get them on all these different technologies, like devices, shooting. Yeah, I think projected target training with like simulators good. Those are really good. I was fortunate enough to have those. Those are really good, but not everybody can afford those.
Sure. What about, let's say, somebody says young, and let's say they're, they've been shooting for a while, law enforcement is their background, and they're like really excited about competition shooting. How do I become a grandmaster? What kind of schedule should I have in a week? Let's say starting on Monday, I'm gonna start training. What should my schedule be for the next 5 days or 7 days?
Everybody's a little different, but I can tell you what I did. 6 to 7 days a week, hour and a half to 2 hours of dry firing.
Hour and a half to 2 hours dry firing per day.
6 to 7 days.
6 to 7
Most
days.
days, 7 days. And you can break that apart, right? It's better to break it apart than do it all in one. In general, you get up in the morning, you do like 15 minutes, 20 minutes. And then when you have a break at work, you might go do some more dry firing. You come home, do some dry firing. It's kind of like Michael Jordan with his basketball. He's always dribbling it,
Yeah.
right? And then at least one practice session with about 200 to 300 rounds a week, meaning you're setting up courses, short courses, get yourself on a timer. You try to beat your time each time. Mix it up, don't always do the same thing. Strong hand, weak hand, shooting on the move, awkward positions.
And your
that
dry
kind of
fire
stuff.
should.
Yeah, when you
be the
dry
same,
fire,
right?
you should mimic what you're doing live fire and make every round count and work on your shortcomings. If you reload slow, practice that a lot. If you draw slow, practice a lot. Strong hand, weak hand. Always start off with your weak points. So practice live fire once a week at least. Some people do like several times a week, but I think once a week, and then shoot a match 3 times, at least 3 times a month on the weekends, preferably 4. And I did that, and I made GM in my first one a year and a half.
So I'm only dry firing like 15, 20 minutes a day. So it's going to take me till I'm like 70.
Yeah, if you're gonna, you gotta. People discount dry fire. It's everything. Why is dry fire everything? With the caveat that you got to confirm it with the live fire. If you don't confirm it with the live fire, then you may be doing the dry fire incorrectly, right? So dry fire is really important because you're establishing kinesthetic memory of the pathway where the barrel and your eyes and the dot or the sight is lining up. So that's what you're trying to do. And so that's why red dot optic dry firing has so much more meaning, because your dry firing is a lot more accurate, because on the sight you may be making some mistakes there. Front sight is a little high, a little low, to the left or right. You may be making mistakes there. The red dot, you can see it right away. So red dot has meaning, more meaning, because it gets you to the kinesthetic memory of pointing the gun where you look and the muzzle pointing at the target where you're aiming at. So that done repeatedly is the most important. And you don't always have to do it from the draw. You can just do it from the ready. You can do it from picking it off the table, picking it up from your hand. You want to have that gun in your hand so that you can tell by feel whether you're going to be off to the left or right or not. So that's where you want to be. Right now, I got a new gun that I've been working with for a couple of months, and painstakingly, I'm back to doing dry fires over and over again. And it's starting to happen. I'm starting to hit everything I see. I don't have to really search for the dot, worry about it. The dot's going to be there. It's starting to happen.
And that's just through dry fire.
Just through dry firing. And the grip angle is different. The setup is different, so I have to do a lot of work. And people say, well, if you do that, then what about the other guns? you don't have kinesthetic memory of just one thing. People think, sometimes they call it muscle memory. There's no such a thing as muscle memory. It's kinesthetic
Yeah,
memory.
but most people know what you mean when you say
Yeah.
muscle memory. Right?
Some people call it muscle memory. Doesn't happen with one thing. So meaning they go, well, if I shoot a Glock all the time, and then shoot 1911 all the time, I'm gonna mess up on both or whatever. True, if you don't put the work in. If you put the work in equally with all the weapons, as soon as you grab it, your emotional state will take over, and you get the right within a couple of presentations. You get the kinesthetic memory back because it's all in the brain in different compartments. So, like, I can shoot a Glock. I don't like to shoot a Glock, but I can shoot a Glock
Yeah.
pretty well.
But if I'm trying to be a grandmaster, or if it's my
Oh,
carry gun, if I'm
yeah,
a
yeah.
police officer, I should probably stick to the same
Yeah.
one, right?
Yeah, if you're a police officer, you should probably stick with the gun that you shoot at work and you carry should be the same grip angle and set up very similarly to the point where if you present it, you aim where you look. So yeah, I do agree with this. So if you shoot a Glock on duty, don't shoot a SIG
1911.
1911. Don't do that.
Yeah, I tried doing that early on in my career. I would shoot
Yeah.
a 2011 type of a pistol when I was competing, and then I'd try to shoot my Glock on duty. I go back. When I go back on duty to shoot my gun at qualifications, I really struggled. And I finally just I'm going to shoot competition with my Glock. Sometimes I shoot my duty gun, or I would buy another gun that was similar to use for competition, and I'd have a competition gun and a duty gun, and then I'd just kind of mix them in together. So.
Yeah, I agree. And beauty of some of the guns is that, you can change up the grip, change up the slides, but the grip angle stays the same, so that it's not going to be a detriment to carry a smaller gun. It's still going to point for you. So you're trying to get the gun to point for you. So you don't have to search for it. You don't have to think. Because if you start thinking with conscious brain, you're slow, right? You want to just automatically let it happen, use your midbrain as much as possible. And after you get good at it, you can activate your midbrain even under mild stress and use that effectively, And also, if you're in the midbrain or not when you're training, when you're practicing, is if you feel the gun in your hand during recoil, meaning it hurts your hand while you recoil, you're in the frontal lobe. If you don't feel the pain in your hand, like shooting a 40 with sand paper on it, you don't feel the gun in your hand or the recoil in your hand, it doesn't hurt you, but afterwards you look and all the skin is rubbed off your palm. I'm sure you had that experience. And you go, when you put the pro grip, the alcohol-based grip on there, you go, you wince because your skin is all raw.
Yeah.
That means you're on the midbrain. Because when you're in the midbrain, you're not internalizing things. It's not an intentional internal. You're not thinking. Front sight focus is internal. Trigger pinning tends to be more of the internal. You want to be external. You want to be looking at the target, experiencing the target. Everything else will become natural and automatic. Brain will disregard the pain and all of that else. So you want to experience. This is why I like to shoot matches versus practice. Only way I can get into midbrain in practice if I put myself on a timer and make things something at stake for me. Like, if I don't do this in 10 seconds and get all A's, I'm not having that cookie. Something like that, right? Right? Something at stake. So you want to train in
What
the
kind of
midbrain.
cookie?
Oatmeal
Fortune cookie?
I don't eat a lot of cookies, but when I do eat it, it's usually oatmeal. But I try not to eat the carbs, but, it's hard, right?
Yeah. So I want to go back to, people who've mentioned to you that this type of training has worked for them in a shooting or a gunfight. What kind of things have they said? Anything specifically like, hey, this is the one thing that I believe helped me and other officers should do it?
Oh, yeah, I think it's mainly vision related.
Yeah,
What they saw.
I remember years ago talking to Benny Cooley, who's a world champion three-gunner, and he's won many other championships. I remember him saying, dude, shooting's all visual.
All visual. And if you can see, you can do more with your hands too. Just think about it. How much can you do under low light? Not a lot. I mean, unless you have your weapon light and then you light up the place, then you start feeling like you can do more.
Mm-hmm.
Right? When you're pitch black, you just kind of start clamming up, and things just don't, when you can't see, things just don't work very well. So vision is everything. So it's really important, segueing right into weapon manner light, flashlights. You need to have a good light under low light. So more you can see under low light, the better decisions you're going to make, and you're going to do it faster and more efficiently.
Yeah. But so, like some of these officers that you say that that you've trained, maybe that have been in shootings, like have they said like the type of training, how you trained, what was it that kind
of? Some of the things primarily is what they saw when they shot and what they hit.
Being
and how they hit,
focused.
Target focused, and just they're aware that they're seeing actual hits happen. Like this one guy, little gangster, he had a puffy jacket, and there was duck feather flying all over the place, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But not only that, teaching them under stress. Remember I talked about the pause technique? Mm-hmm. So like if they're standing there, how many times you seen this? They're standing there after the suspect goes down. They're pointing the gun and yelling commands with the lock back gun.
Yeah.
You see that often.
You do.
So when you see that, you pause them, and what's going on? What's wrong here? And they evaluate the gun, and then they go, I'm not evaluating my gun. Evaluate the gun, go back to making the gun hot again, and go back. That kind of stuff. So, I did everything you talked about, you and your staff talked about, is not only the target focus, but after the suspect was down, taking some deep breaths, and then doing things like checking your gun, weapon, checking your body, checking your partners, then working on going and getting the suspect, that kind of stuff.
Sure.
Under stuff that we taught them, under the midbrain. So that's what they're thankful for.
That's good to know. Is there anything else? We've been going for about, almost an hour and a half, or actually a little bit more. I know you got a few notes there. Is there anything that you want to bring up? Anything that we haven't hit so far?
I think that's about it. I think I covered everything. Hopefully.
Yeah, we covered a lot of items there, a lot of topics.
One thing that I would recommend when you're teaching people, not a lot of people can do drills with moving targets, right? Swing targets, laterally traversing target. Those aren't that effective because they're so easy to shoot. Human beings don't move like laterally traversing, paper target or cardboard target. I guess swinger is more realistic, but instead of doing that, have them shoot multiple targets.
Okay.
The reason is you're transitioning between targets. However, that also correlates to tracking a moving target.
Okay. So if you got 3 or 4 targets
Yeah.
in a row, shoulder to shoulder, it's almost like
Left
you're
to
tracking
right, right to left. Shoot them to middle to left, right, left, middle, because body moves all direction. Mm-hmm. So you want to train them so that wherever they look, the gun's going to be there. They don't have to search for the sights or the dot. So shooting multiple targets during training is really important.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with that. All right, Young. I think we'll probably be calling it good. We're up to about our timeline, and I think my battery's about to go dead here too.
That's perfect.
So I think we've covered a lot, and hopefully we'll have you back on. This is a pretty new podcast, so hopefully we'll get some good reviews, and we'll get people listening to the 1032 podcast, and we'll have you on again. And hopefully we can get some training going on.
Anytime.
Are you going to be teaching any classes around here anytime soon? Or
right now I got one tentatively back at my old department. They want me to come back and do some training for them. But other than that, I'm just kind of scaling things down a little bit. I like my time too much.
Yeah.
But if somebody wants to, really wants me to be there, I'll be there. You know.
All right.
It's
Well, hopefully
really
I can
worth-
talk you into teaching a class here locally, and we can bring.
Oh yeah,
people
we can do
in,
that too.
so.
Yeah, definitely. And appreciate you having me.
Well, thanks for
Look forward to
being
it.
here. I'm always trying to pick your brain, trying to get a little better at shooting myself. So I hopefully maybe you can teach me a little more so I can finally.
No, you're there
I
already.
can put-
you just don't know it
I,
yet.
I just need to get over that wall, get over that 84% to 85.
You just gotta let it go, man. You gotta let it go. You have all the skills already. All right.
All
man.
right, Yang. Well,
Yeah, appreciate
good
it.
having you. All right, thanks.